It is the late summer of 1347. A Genoese ship is crossing the Black Sea, departing from its colonies in Crimea and returning to Italy via Sicily. During the trip back home, they stop at many important port centers in the area to restock and trade, one of these stops being Constantinople, the capital of the dying Eastern Roman Empire. But unbeknownst to them, those Genoese merchants would bring with them the first victims of what would soon become the most terrifying and deadly plague the world had ever seen. But in this alternate timeline, by some kind of miracle, magic, or perhaps divine intervention, a single civilization and culture would be blessed with total and absolute immunity to the pandemic that would become known as the Black Death. The Eastern Roman Empire, not even a shadow of what it once was, would now have the opportunity to redeem itself and reassert its power as the true heirs of ancient Rome, having received the divine gift of complete immunity to the Black Death, perhaps giving them the advantage they needed to finally return to their former glory. Hello everyone, and today we're going to explore a completely unrealistic and crazy alternate scenario once again, but still funny and fascinating to imagine. What if the Eastern Roman Empire was not affected by the Black Death? That's the alternate scenario we're going to explore today. So what do I mean by not affected? Basically, the famous Black Death of the 14th century, the pandemic that marked the history of humanity as the most brutal and deadly pandemic that history has ever recorded, will continue to appear throughout the Old World during the 14th century as in our timeline, with the only difference here that the Eastern Roman Empire, its inhabitants and its borders, will be completely immune to the plague. Just like that, without any logical or rational explanation, they will simply be all immune to the plague without exception. Because let's be real here for a moment, Eastern Rome, in retrospect, had one of the most tragic and unfair histories of all the great empires in history, always from its beginning to its end, having to adopt a defensive position until it had nothing left. Honestly, if any civilization deserves a magical plague immunity freebie, it's these poor guys who went through all this. So yeah, I kind of think they deserve some kind of an unfair advantage with magical plague immunity after all of that. So okay, Eastern Rome is immune to the Black Death, but how does that work? What are the limits of that immunity? How would it affect the empire if it expands territorially? Well, here are the rules for how that immunity would work in this alternate scenario. Firstly, and as I mentioned before, from the beginning, absolutely all the inhabitants within the borders of what remained of the Eastern Roman Empire would be completely immune to the plague, except of course those who would be foreigners passing by, mercenaries loyal to money and not to the emperor and the state, among other merchants not originally from that place. Those would continue to die of the plague exactly the same as in our timeline. There is only one way to become immune to the Black Death, and that is if you defect from your home kingdom or empire and swear loyalty to the Eastern Roman Emperor and his culture, and if the oath is genuine and not just a convenient action with empty words, then you will become completely immune to the Black Death, and if you were already infected with the plague, you will be instantly cured of it after swearing your oath to Eastern Rome. Once you swear loyalty to Eastern Rome, you'll be able to leave its borders and remain completely immune to the Black Death, no matter how much contact you might have with people infected with it. It's largely thanks to this that the empire could once again conquer and expand beyond its borders of 1347. And speaking of borders, now that we've talked about how the Eastern Romans' immunity to the Black Death worked and what the rules of this magic immunity were, let's talk about the state of the Eastern Roman Empire in 1347, just before the Black Death began. Since the Fourth Crusade in 1204 and the reconquest of Constantinople from the Latins in 1261, the Eastern Roman Empire has never been able to return to its former glory prior to the arrival of the Seljuk Turks. Since then, it has been a constant and sad fall into the abyss of the progressive defragmentation of what little remained of what was once Rome, not even a shadow of what it used to be by 1347. During the months and years leading up to the Black Death, besides waging a civil war, as was very common in the long Roman history, they also had to deal with the aggressive conquest by the Serbian Empire of most of mainland Greece, with the Serbian Emperor Stefan Dusan dealing another brutal blow to the dying Eastern Rome, only leaving after those conflicts a minuscule part of their territories to the north, composed mostly of Thrace and Constantinople, some islands around the Aegean Sea, but very few, most of them being under Venetian or Genoa control, and a part of the Peloponnesos controlled by the Despotate of the Morea, an Eastern Roman state that, although independent, was still completely loyal to Constantinople. Its total population was reduced to just 4 million inhabitants, and at most, Eastern Rome at that time had the capacity to muster a maximum of 10,000 men for its army. An army, whom many of them were unreliable foreign mercenaries, while even the once proud native troops were too few and too poor to hold the line alone, with the emperor relying on foreign mercenaries, loyal to money and not to Rome, mostly Italians, Slavs, and yes, even Turks, so not the most trustworthy guys around. The empire that had once commanded legions now depended on the goodwill of Italian city-states and Turkish warlords, a true tragedy and downfall for this once glorious empire and civilization. But now, with the tremendous change in this new timeline of an Eastern Rome immune to the Black Death, while the rest of its neighbors would still suffer the plague in the same way as in our true history, its chances of surviving and returning as a great, powerful empire and one that could impose its conditions were again possible, and that is what we are going to see next. During the first weeks of the plague, the Eastern Romans would be unaware of the existence of the Black Death, preoccupied with fighting the Serbs, who were about to conquer almost all of mainland Greece. But as the months passed, they would inevitably obtain information from outside, first from Serb deserters, but also from sailors, Italian merchants, and other peoples with whom they traded, about this terrible plague that was devastating them all across Europe and the known world in general. There, the Eastern Romans would realize that the slowdown or complete halt of other powers like the Ottomans, Bulgarians, or even Serbians in advancing into the few territories they had left was not a mere coincidence or just luck, but that they were literally being incapacitated by a plague that was wiping out a huge portion of their population. Now aware of the Black Death by the early 1348, the Eastern Romans would have been terrified and panicking, because due to having interacted with those infected with the plague and learned about it, they would have thought rightfully that this terrible plague would now affect them as well. But weeks would pass, and then months, and by the early 1349, absolutely nothing would happen. There was no record of a Greek loyal to Eastern Rome contracting the plague within its remaining territories. However, foreign merchants or mercenaries more loyal to Eastern Rome's money than to their own state and emperor continued to contract the Black Death, regardless of if they were in Eastern Rome territory. It was then that, little by little, the Eastern Romans would realize that perhaps they had been blessed by God himself, and that although it didn't make any sense, for some reason, all those who were loyal to the Eastern Roman Empire were completely immune to the Black Death within its borders, and once they swore loyalty within the Eastern Roman territories, they could leave those same Eastern Roman territories and still be completely immune. That realization would rekindle a powerful flame in the hearts of all Romans, a flame that they thought they had lost long ago, especially after the Fourth Crusade, a flame that would revive their spirit of struggle, of greatness, and of conquest, realizing that God had blessed them with his grace to be the only ones immune to that plague, being a clear sign of divine legitimacy, that the Lord wanted them, and only them, to stand out again as the predominant Christian civilization in the known world. John VI Cantacuzenos would gain a legitimacy unmatched in the history of all leaders in human history. His divine right to reign over his subjects and empire was incontestable. It was not just mere talk or political propaganda, but there was direct proof that perhaps it was true that the Romans were destined for even more under his reign and that of his successor, John V Palaiologos. With a population restricted to a smaller territory, allowing information to spread more quickly, Roman vigor and fervor would be rekindled in the hearts of all its remaining inhabitants, being able to recruit many more men to be trained as soldiers, motivated by the possibilities of Roman reconquest in such a divinely providential situation for all of them. In that context, it was not such a big issue that the imperial wealth reserves were almost empty, and that the empire was in an economic collapse, because the promise of new, abandoned, and extremely fertile lands to conquer and inherit for their soldiers was a gigantic incentive, in addition to the promulgation of Orthodox Christianity, associated as the main reason for immunity to the Black Death. While in our timeline at this point, Eastern Rome could at most muster a force of 10,000 soldiers by being extremely optimistic, due to the few territorial and economic resources they had left, but on top of that, 90% of those soldiers were only foreign mercenaries and not local Greeks, but in this alternate timeline, for the first time in a long time, Although the army wouldn't be of great quality due to the newly integrated recruits, the majority of soldiers would be totally native Greeks, being a homogeneous group composed of 90% of native Greeks from mainland Greece and/or Anatolia, with the remaining 10% being Italians, Turks, or some Bulgarians, totally converted to Orthodox Christianity and completely loyal to the Roman Empire and the Emperor, traumatized by having lost their families and friends to the Black Death, which, for some divine reason, maybe from the hand of God himself, knew how to recognize when the oath of loyalty was genuine and true, and not just some insincere and inept words for the convenience of the moment, but not a genuine desire inside one's mind and heart, being able, after a few months of local recruitment, to go from an army composed of at most 10,000 soldiers, the majority of whom were foreign mercenaries with dubious loyalty, to 40,000 soldiers newly integrated into the Roman army, with 90% of them being entirely native Greeks. By the spring of 1350, still taking advantage of the mortality rate at its peak of the Black Death, the Eastern Romans, now more prepared and more numerous than they had been for a long time, would launch multiple successive campaigns against the Serbs to reconquer mainland Greece. But their reconquest would not be based solely on military force and strategy. After all, the new recruits lacked the necessary experience to fight prolonged campaigns, and the Eastern Romans had long since become accustomed to not waging large-scale wars and battles in an organized and disciplined manner, too accustomed to relying on outside aid or mercenaries. No, their greatest ace up their sleeve would be the divine propaganda of immunity to the Black Death, encouraging Serbs, Albanians, and Bulgarians to rejoin the Roman Empire, and that this would save them from the terrible Black Death by the grace of the Lord. Imagine you're a medieval peasant from the Balkans of that time, living in a village devastated and depopulated by the Black Death. Almost all of your family and friends have died, and you can barely feed yourself due to a lack of hands to work the land. Then suddenly one day, Greeks and Orthodox priests arrive to explain and demonstrate to you with concrete evidence that if you swear loyalty to the Roman Empire and the Emperor, you will become completely immune to the Black Death. Obviously, this would have an enormous psychological impact on the medieval peasant, creating a huge motivation and incentive to join the empire, and that will be the case for thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people from different groups. And with a traumatized, hungry, and tired population suffering from disease, conflict, famine, and the Black Death itself, it is only natural that they would want to find the quickest solution to these problems. And if that guarantees them immunity to the Black Death, with absolutely everyone infected by the plague being cured immediately as if nothing had happened from that horrible disease the moment they swear loyalty to Eastern Rome, then the massive abandonment of loyalty to their previous leaders to swear loyalty to the Eastern Romans would be enormous. The shift in population to serve another empire, coupled with the brutal rural exodus to the most populated areas of Eastern Rome, and the Black Death still wreaking havoc throughout the Balkans, I believe that within a few months, mostly due to a lack of motivated men and thousands of deserters moving to the other side, the Serbian Empire would fall, with Stefan Dusan being captured or killed, which in any case wouldn't be very important, considering that he would die of illness a few years later in our timeline. With Eastern Rome now having spread across a large part of the Balkans, it would once again become a notable power that would attract a lot of attention. Little by little, the other great European and Muslim powers would become aware of the shocking and unexpected Eastern Roman resurgence, shocked and even disgusted by the inexplicable prosperity and success of those Greeks in times of plague, disease, war, and death so abundant throughout the continent, not understanding how it was even possible such a resurgence in power. During the years 1352 and 1353, Eastern Rome would also reconquer Bulgaria, expanding once again across the Danube, having regained remarkable military strength and legitimacy, but also a gigantic population increase. Everyone who swore loyalty to Eastern Rome either became immune to the Black Death or quickly recovered from it for those already infected, creating factual and indisputable proof of Rome's divine legitimacy. There would literally be no exceptions to the rule, with Greco-Roman culture gaining ground again, in addition to a more aggressive spread of orthodoxy, being able to recruit more than a decent number of soldiers for those times of Black Death, when men were needed in most European armies, especially in France and England, where the 100 Years' War continued to be fought despite the circumstances. Now that Eastern Rome had secured a large, stable, and above all loyal territory in the Balkans, and knowing that the Catholic European powers were too weak or too preoccupied with their own wars to pose a real problem for the moment, the attention of the emperors John VI Cantacuzenos and John V would turn towards Anatolia, determined to reconquer those historically important territories for the Romans, with still a gigantic Greek-speaking population living there, scattered among the different Turkish dynasties that represented a huge threat to the Eastern Romans. The different Turkish dynasties in Anatolia would have also been severely affected by the Black Death, but the Ottomans, for example, being an already highly militarized people, and with an extremely young population and a huge birth rate for their small size, would manage to recover quickly, not being an easy reconquest at all for the Eastern Romans. However, now, with the total loyalty of most of the Balkans, a number of soldiers consequent for the time and the current situation of the known world after the Black Death, such a reconquest would not be completely out of the reach of the Romans, not to mention that the local Ottoman and Anatolian populations, mostly Greek and Orthodox still, having heard the rumors and stories of Eastern Rome's immunity to the Black Death, many of them would desert to swear loyalty to Eastern Rome and the co-emperors, although that would not be the case for the Muslim Turks, too indoctrinated and fanaticized by Islam to give in to such pressure, even with all the evidence before their eyes of Eastern Rome's immunity to the plague. The reconquest would be a difficult and tedious one, but the Ottomans would be going through political and dynastic instability, with also the defection and abandonment of many local Greeks and native Anatolians in favor of Eastern Rome, which would leave the Ottomans with fewer soldiers to wage wars, and especially replenishment with abandoned agricultural lands, which would leave the young Ottoman state weakened enough so that after a few years of constant warfare, the Eastern Romans could finally reconquer much of Western Anatolia by the year 1360, completely eradicating the Ottoman Turks from history, thus preventing their ascension that in another world would have been one of the largest and most dangerous empires in history. And over the next few years, Eastern Rome would spread across the entire northern Anatolian coast without much trouble, with the majority of that population still being Greek-speaking and Orthodox, with even the Empire of Trebizond openly accepting to return to being part of the Roman Empire, while the Kingdom of Georgia would need more diplomatic compromises, but everything being done in peaceful negotiations without the need for battles or armies confronting each other, eventually achieving certain dynastic agreements and political marriages to unify Georgia with the rest of the Roman Empire, them too having suffered severely from the Black Death, which would be honestly the main reason to unify with Eastern Rome, due of the huge population drop they suffered. In this alternate timeline, Eastern Rome would have regained its former vigor, once again becoming a notable power that could impose its conditions on other powerful kingdoms and empires, thanks to the miraculous immunity to the Black Death, which would have given them a huge birth rate for the time compared to the rest of their neighbors, with many people wanting to secure themselves, being able to repopulate their land by being immune to the plague as well. John V Palaiologos, now the only sole senior emperor, would never have experienced a crisis of legitimacy and a civil war that would have dethroned him from the position of emperor for a few years before returning until his death, and was able to maintain absolute control and legitimacy that few leaders or monarchs in history could brag about. Such was the impact of the Eastern Romans' immunity to the Black Death. He would spend the last 20 years of his reign reuniting all the remaining Anatolian territories, eradicating as much of the Turkish population as possible, and assimilating those who agreed to surrender to the revived power of Rome and convert to Orthodoxy, a variant of Christianity that in this reality was gaining more and more influence, comparable or even superior to Catholicism, which was in the decline in this timeline, as the world started to be aware of and witness the Eastern Roman resurgence along with its immunity to the Black Death. That would be even more shocking when many Italians in the different colonies they had around the Aegean Sea would decide to desert their city-states and republics, deciding to reunify completely with Eastern Rome and swear loyalty to the Roman Emperor out of mere pragmatism and the need to survive the terrible Black Death, and in the process convert to Orthodoxy as well, which would be received as terrible and terrifying news in the West, especially by the Pope of Rome, with Catholicism greatly weakening in religious and, above all, institutional legitimacy, having not been able to protect the Europeans from the terrible plague as the Eastern Romans evidently and unquestionably did. By the year 1400, Eastern Rome had recovered the vitality it had not possessed since the times of Basil II, having a population totally loyal and faithful to the empire, as well as fully Orthodox, with the religion becoming increasingly popular among fanatical inhabitants, convinced of the saving powers of that religion against the terrible Black Death. But by that point, the plague had almost completely stopped and would not return except in sporadic moments for the next few centuries. But that wouldn't matter. The advantage Eastern Rome had had over its enemies for the past 50 years would be over, and now they would have to prove, without cheating, whether they were still worthy of being the heirs of ancient Rome and capable of continuing to face any obstacle or, again, decline in power and influence until they returned to the point of collapse they were at before the Black Death. But I have no doubt that, given the Eastern Romans' great adaptability and capacity to reform themselves in the past, they would be capable of doing it again, restructuring their government, taxation system, army, land management, and provinces, adapting to the new realities of more modern times. They would also revive ancient Roman customs and administrative laws in order to further emphasize this revitalization of the old Roman civilization. In this timeline, Greek identity would remain behind the Roman one thanks to that brutal Eastern Roman resurgence, with the cultural interest and historical legacy of ancient Rome being rediscovered way earlier, creating a fervor that would ignite the flames of the Renaissance many decades before our timeline. While that wouldn't really matter, what would matter would be where that early Renaissance occurred, being it in the Greek world rather than the Italian world, with Eastern Rome and Constantinople in particular once again becoming the cultural and academic center of the known world, with many intellectuals from various parts of the Catholic and Muslim worlds immigrating to those lands in exchange for converting to Orthodoxy and swearing allegiance to Eastern Rome, a criterion that would have become the basis for the integration of foreigners into their empire by that point after the events of the Black Death. But Eastern Rome would extend its influence beyond its borders by now, having gradually managed to institutionalize orthodoxy on a similar scale to that achieved by Catholicism centuries before, having managed to convert the Kingdom of Hungary to orthodoxy, a historic event that would deeply mark and traumatize Roman Catholics. But in general terms, the Catholic Church would have been severely weakened in the last decades, with a serious crisis of legitimacy being felt throughout Europe, starting to lose influence and power over the other representatives of Christianity around the continent, accelerating the process that would eventually lead to the reforms of Protestantism in our timeline, but much earlier and on a larger scale, and with less opposition from the European kingdoms, tired, weakened, depopulated, and fed up with the inefficient Roman papal authority to unify and pacify their populations, with many having immigrated and deserted to join Eastern Rome in previous decades to save themselves from the Black Death, causing Western Europe to lose a significant part of its population still alive even after the Black Death, greatly weakening all the kingdoms and empires of Europe, in addition to their local agricultural performance, not making things easier in the case of the 100 Years' War between France and England that was still happening, much more in favor of the English in this alternate timeline. By the early 15th century, the population of Europe would be around 30 million inhabitants, while Eastern Rome would have a population of around 20 million inhabitants, thanks to the massive defection of inhabitants from other Catholic European kingdoms or from Eastern Muslims, and the high birth rate of the empire due to the absence of the Black Death, being able to greatly redevelop the infrastructures of Eastern Roman society and rebuilding cities to their former glory, with Constantinople even surpassing its past peak of 500,000 inhabitants. But now, with the European powers slowly recovering from those hellish decades, furious and jealous of the successful resurgence of Eastern Rome, they would start to rebuild, reorganize, and pacify the different religious revolutions throughout Europe that wanted to separate from the Catholic Church to eventually confront Eastern Rome once and for all, and put an end to their ambitious revitalization and reconquest, which, if it continued like this, could endanger all their kingdoms, and also, worse for them, but better for the Eastern Romans, finally revive the true Roman Empire. But that, only time will tell or not if Eastern Rome would be capable of such a feat, especially now without having any special advantage against its enemies anymore. But no one doubts that having been immune to the Black Death, and through that event, having unified a gigantic population under Eastern Roman control, left them with all the key elements to re-emerge once again as the great Western civilization that should never have fallen from the starters. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope you enjoyed this story. Honestly, I really liked that alternate scenario I created. I really enjoyed creating it, and for the first time since I started making videos, I have concrete ideas in mind to continue that story. But I don't know. I'm still not sure if it's worth it, especially for such an unrealistic scenario, where the Eastern Romans are immune to the Black Death. Let me know what you think about that idea and the possibility of one day continuing that story. And if you convince me enough, I'll create a community poll on my channel so you can vote on whether you really want to continue watching the adventures of that revived Eastern Roman immune to the Black Death or not. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel in order to have early access to new videos, and comment on what you thought of it. And without anything else to say, see you next time.